we're here today to discuss the Facebook files, the documents gathered by and testified to by Frances Haugen and reported on by the Wall Street Journal. And we're asking the question, what's next? Frances, welcome. It's great to have you here, and hopefully the lights stay on. I would love to hear, like, if there was a moment, one moment that kind of like flipped a switch for you, if it was a gradual kind of decision, how you got here. I think everyone would love to hear that story. So please go ahead and tell us, like, what was the thing that kind of made you, as you have told me in text messages, just like pick a path of kind of civil disobedience?
So I knew that misinformation was dangerous before I came to Facebook. So I got quite ill in 2014, and I had to relearn to walk. It's been covered in my Wall Street Journal profile. And I had a close friend who was my assistant. I had hired him to help me just get my life in order. Like, I was weak enough that I couldn't carry heavy things, that kind of thing. And he took me walking every day for months. You know, he'd take me swimming 5 days a week. He loved to lift, and he taught me about macros and protein. And he got radicalized on the internet in 2016. And it was one of the more painful experiences of my life, because this person was really, really important to me. And I watched him go from being this smart, funny, compassionate, college-educated guy. Like, he knew lots, and still a trickle drip of information that turned into a flood, pushed him to a place where he believed like George Soros was running the world economy, and nothing I could do could really pull him back from that ledge. And so when I had the opportunity to join to work on civic misinformation in 2019, I took that opportunity, because I didn't want anyone to feel that pain that I had felt, and I wanted to do my best that in the run up to the 2020 election, that we didn't see a repeat of 2016, where you had nation state actors distributing all sorts of things on the platform. Once I got there, it was an incredibly eye-opening experience, because I thought Facebook was problematic in the United States, right? I had seen the effects of it. Facebook is, the version we see in the United States is the most sanitized, clean version of Facebook. And I kept learning thing after thing after thing. I didn't have an appreciation for the scale of how many people die from ethnic violence that's fanned by the choices that Facebook makes on the platform, or Facebook's choices to underinvest in security systems for people who don't speak, say, English. And as I learned more about the company and how it was operating, I began to have less and less faith that it could be corrected internally because of how the company itself was run. The moment that kind of pushed me over the edge, where I was like, well, it is clear to me that this will not be solved internally. I didn't know how I would bring information to the public, but I knew that I was going to have to do something. It was when they disbanded the civic integrity team after the US 2020 election. Because Facebook said, civic integrity is so important, we need to incorporate it into all the parts of our operation. But many, many, many of the people who worked on civic integrity had quit the company by even 6 months after that event, including everyone who was in my immediate pod of product managers. All of them left either our team or left the company within a 6-week span in around May 2021, excuse me. And so that's what brought me here, is that I saw that what we see in Myanmar and what we see in Ethiopia are only the opening chapters of a novel that has an ending that is far scarier than any of us want to read. These are not novel experiences. These are things that we see over and over again in different levels of intensity around the world. And I believe that we still have time to be able to have social media that brings out the best in humanity. But that's not going to come about unless we help guide Facebook in that direction and we change the incentives.
Great. And that actually leads perfectly to my first question for you. So in the last few weeks, since the journal articles came out, since it has been a few weeks, but the last few days since the testimony came out, there have been a lot of different people from like a lot of different ideologies laying claim to you, to just put it frankly, to like laying claim to you, and to like laying claim to your facts that you bring forward, and laying claim to your stories. And I like, as kind of like I try to be like kind of impartial and kind of survey the scene, and it's fascinating to kind of see like these two different like people who I think would never disagree, both claim or never agree, both saying that like she proved my point, or this is what we've been saying forever. And one of the things, I'll just sum up a couple of them. A lot of people saying that you're anti-Facebook, that you're anti-big tech, right? A lot of people saying that that in the political sphere, saying that the American right is you're proving that the American right is unfairly censored on like social media. And then there's, and then other people kind of saying that like even your actions were an example of kind of a call out culture and not a whistleblower type of action. And so I just kind of wanted to give you a chance to kind of just directly like respond to some of that, and to like say it in your own words, kind of whether like what's kind of happened in the last couple of weeks, and kind of what, I don't know how much of that you've read, but I'm sure you're aware of some of it. And so I'm just kind of thought I'd turn that over to you.
I really don't view this as a political issue. Like, I think what Tristan flagged is like really the fundamental, if there is a political narrative, that should be the fundamental political narrative, which is when there's an oil spill, it doesn't decrease the ability of the government to regulate oil firms. But as Facebook decays, it actually, and in the process decays our information environment, or inflames us towards more extreme and divisive positions. It actually hurts our ability to ever regulate Facebook. And so I view it as a bipartisan issue. Like, this is a thing where, if we want to live in a society where we treat each other with respect, if we don't want a cancel culture, we need to not have systems of information that choose for us what to focus on, and choose based on anger and extreme positions. A lot of the coverage has been really, really positive. Like, the thing that I've been really, really happy with is I've seen people on both sides of the aisle say things like it's not just that everyone seems to think that I'm validating something about what they're saying, but people are also coming out and say like, hey, we never agree on anything. Like, we all would like to rein in Facebook. I think there's also really interesting grounds for cooperation. So like some people on the right have said, she's a dark horse. She wants to censor us. And it's so funny for me because I literally said in my testimony in front of the Senate, I don't believe that the solution is going to be picking good ideas and bad ideas. Because any system that has to pick good ideas and bad ideas is a language-based system. And beyond the fact that those don't work, right, that Facebook's own documents say, best case scenario for violence inciting content, hate speech, you're only going to get 10 to 20% of the content. And that's if we do a huge investment, right? So beyond the fact that they just don't work, if we want to protect the most vulnerable people in the world, so that's people who live in places at risk for ethnic violence, we can't have language-based systems because those places are linguistically diverse. So we look at a place like Ethiopia and there's 6 languages there. There's 100 million people, 6 languages. Even with people starting to die there from this, Facebook only supports 2 of those languages. And the economics just doesn't work. If we use systems that are per language based, they're not going to scale to the most fragile people in the most fragile places in the world. So I feel like this is a thing people on the right and the left could come together, right? Like, chronological ranking with maybe some spam demotion is a safer thing that will protect more people, and everyone on the right who's worried about being censored, there's less of that fear there then.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point, and I'm just going to take a moment to kind of like have you expound on it a little bit more, because I think that this is key. First of all, I think that people assume that at the scale that they're, and this is impossible at the scale they're doing that, but that the platforms can read everything, to put it like another, like that they're able to look at the content, and that they're not looking at the behavior of the content, how it's being shared, how it's moving, how it's being amplified, or how it's going around. And they're not making decisions based on that. And I think, and I'm interested to hear, Tristan, if you agree with this, and Francis, obviously, if you agree with this, but this idea that like, I think that our basic levels of content moderation started with getting rid of spam and getting rid of pornography, which were both shared, and that ended up being behaviorally based, not pornography as much. That's still hard to like police, but spam is very behavioral. That's like how they track it and figure out how to take it down. And so one of the things that Tristan just said is kind of this idea that there's not good or bad, but like that and the idea of just pure growth or pure engagement as being a net good is not true. Like, neither are these platforms necessarily making good or bad decisions or only optimizing for this one metric. So I'm very curious, what do you see? Do you see a behavioral solution to this problem from the company, or do you see this having to come from some type of external regulation to force them to take a behavioral solution to this problem?
A lot of the reason why they haven't, so there's lots and lots of behavioral based solutions that are flagged within the documents. The thing that has kept Facebook from, so to give you an example, reshare chains. So like, let's say you write something, I reshare it, Meetali shares it, that's 2 hops long. If it shows up in Shoshana's feed, she at that point would have to copy and paste it before it would go on, right? She's not being oppressed, right? Copy and pasting is not oppression. But changes like that, really simple ones that reduce virality, that's a behavioral
and build in friction.
And build in friction. It gives people a chance to think, like, do I care about this thing enough to keep pushing it along? Those kinds of changes radically decrease the amount of misinformation on the platform, right? Like on a similar like scale with like the entire third-party fact-checking program. But the problem is changes like that also hurt growth for Facebook by tiny little bits. We're talking 0.2% of sessions, that kind of thing. And part of it also is that some countries in the world don't have as much original content production. So there are some countries where 35% of everything shown in the feed is a reshare. And so Facebook's very protective of that virality, because instead of trying to get us to create more original content, they're just recycling this old content, even though it has negative consequences.
That's a great point. Does anyone want to add anything? I'm happy to let other people follow up. Tristan?
I just think what Frances said is so important. First of all, it's pointing to one very, very short-term, not solution, but at least to make it a lot safer, which is, we could make a change right now. I mean, it's literally a couple lines of code for them to say something like, that reshare button goes away after it gets shared twice. And the second thing Frances said, I want to make sure people get it, because it's so important. We think that social media is bad in the West and in the US and all the polarization dynamics. But if you're in one of these developing countries and most of your feed is these like 20 chain long reshares, right? You get these basically conspiracy. I mean, the evidence in Facebook's documents is that the longer something gets reshared, like the thing that gets reshared 20 times, the more likely it is to be misinformation, toxic information, bad stuff, right? And so, but the reason that they do that is that if people are posting not so often in some of these countries, then you go to your Facebook feed and there's nothing there. And so this is a decision that's based purely on growth. And so you have to imagine, like, empathizing. I'm opening my feed in Ethiopia, or a place where there's actually conflict. I'm seeing all just the worst stuff, and what that experience is like. And then just like climate change, where the developing world gets the worst of it. I mean, most of the resources on content moderation, which we know actually only has a side effect of polarizing people more, especially in polarized societies. Most of those resources, though, are spent in English-speaking countries or Western countries. And even Avaz did a great sort of diagram of sort of a justice denied is justice delayed, that basically the number of days it takes to sort of fact check some of the worst misinformation in English is like 1 or 2 days. And then if you're in French, it's like 4 or 5 days. And then if you're in Italian, it's like 20 days. And so then you go wait, you get to the long tail. And you start to see how this is just kind of a dangerous thing. And just to say, nowhere is it written that our society needs virality. Why do we need that thing? There's a story, I'll just share one quick story, because someone told me this about Apple back in the day, that when Steve Jobs was shown an updated version of the podcast app, where someone said, hey, what if we made there was a feed? And so you could see what your friends were listening to, which podcast episodes, then you could like and you could comment, basically turning the podcast app into a social network. And my understanding from this person is that Steve responded, no, that's a ridiculous idea. Why would you do that? Because if something was actually genuinely worth someone else's attention, which is the most precious thing on earth, people would copy the link and then send it by a text. And I think some of the best things and most important things that we needed to know, someone, texted and shared that thing. Now, I know in saying this, there's a lot of people who don't like this, because what virality does, essentially, it opens up the variance quadrant. It says, hey, we're going to get a lot more QAnons, and we're going to get a lot more Satoshi-anons, right? We're going to get Gun Gum style, and we're all going to laugh more, right? And so but you're opening up the variance thing. But I think the question is, and Facebook and Twitter and everyone else will always point out the positive things that come from that variance, the positive viral videos, the keyboard cat, whatever it is. But on the other side of the balance sheet is stuff that breaks down the democracy into not working at all. And so saying that we need to open up that variance, of being blind faith on variance, is like saying, let's just dump Chernobyl radiation on the world because it'll increase the variance of human genetics and we'll get 9-foot tall humans sometimes. It's not worth it when you irradiate the entire population. So I think
Sure.
that's a core thing.
No, I think that this is a great point. And so I actually want to follow up on what you just said. So I think that this is correct. I think that I am not the only one, that there is this idea that that the way that the engagement is happening is like, yes, you might laugh more, but there are fundamentally some things that are a lot of things about our society and democracy and public health that are being eroded. And I think that that's correct. But here is something that like Facebook would say in response to this, or that the platforms would say in response to this, that kind of directly speaks to that point. Is like the number of people who have like engaged and organized in democratic protest, or have been able to run with low, and I'm not trying, okay, of course I am not being an apologist here for the companies, but I think that these are actually really real positives of what the internet and social media brings us. People who don't have the coffers to run a huge local campaign have access to low cost ads targeted specifically in their local demographic. And I want to point out that that's really most valuable in other parts of the world and other places where people have a hard time reaching mass audiences. And I think that some of these things are the things that are either mythologized or are underrated, or are like, I can't tell whether they're under or overrated, I guess is what I'm saying. And I think a lot of the world can't. And one of the things that Francis has talked so eloquently about, and it was the first installment of Jeff Horowitz's Wall Street Journal series, was like really the metrics and what we've talked about so far, this idea of just user engagement. So what about building a better metric? What about being able to build something good to measure along with the bad, not the puppy videos, but like the democratic engagement versus like the democratic erosion? And Francis, can you speak to that?
Well, just before we go on to that, I want to address your like, we're going to have to give up Black Lives Matters. We're going to have to give up the Egyptian Revolution thing. I really don't want this to be a false choice on that one. One of the things that I was most struck by relatively soon after I joined, I learned about what happened. So Pantsuit Nation, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, was a private Facebook group that grew extremely rapidly after the election of Donald Trump. And the thing that was fascinating about this group and kind of like really shaped a lot of my feelings about like, this question on virality, right? Because people have said like, oh, like, we shouldn't reduce virality. Like things need to grow as fast as possible. So Pantsuit Nation was not optimized to grow, right? It got to something like 12 million members in like 2 weeks, but it wasn't optimized to grow. You had to be invited by someone, like someone had to let you into the group to get added to it. And the thing that really struck upon me was ideas whose time has come. Like in a world where you get 2 hops of reshares, ideas can still grow really, really fast with 2 hops of reshares, right? Like if I have a couple thousand friends on Facebook, if I reshare it, if a very small number of those people reshare it, it gets even just my first posting goes out to tens of thousands of people. And so that's the thing. We're not saying you can either have social movements or you can have problems with virality. So I just want to make sure we don't construe it as
I
like
specifically was hoping someone would complicate the false choice that everyone is being provided, is being given. And that was I think that was a really good example of it. Tristan, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that's exactly right. Which is to say, what are safer levels of virality where we can get some things go viral at some coefficient, but it's the difference between like the aggressive Delta variant of COVID and these more innocuous variants that die in the crib, right? I mean, we're just talking about our knots, and we have the Zuckerberg Virality Institute and the TikTok Virality Institute, and for all of them, it actually matters. How viral do we want our society to be? I would say just one thing, and I think other people should really speak, is rights come with responsibilities. And we have decoupled power from responsibility. So just handing out viral megaphones without coupling it with what are the responsibilities of someone who is going to speak to that many people. In other places in our society, the greater the power you have, the greater the responsibility. A doctor has greater power, they have a Hippocratic oath, and because they have so much power in an entangled relationship with you, because they have all your personal information, they know, this is Jack Balkin's and Jonathan Zittrain's argument, I have all the privileged information on you, I can make, if I tell you or give you advice on medicine, you're going to take my advice. The amount of power that I have, I mean, plus the fact that I have a prediction engine, so taking Shoshana's work now, and I can basically have a supercomputer. So I've said this before, but if I'm a priest and I've listened to 2 billion people's confessions, and it's worse than that because I have a supercomputer next to me that can predict the confession you're going to make before you know you're going to make it. In other words, I know things about you don't know about yourself. That power has responsibility. And when you have that degree of asymmetry, that power can only be, in law, in service of the person with much less power. So I sort of flipped the argument I was making there, because originally starting with the power of broadcast or viral speech to the power of technology platforms and the asymmetric influence that they have. But I want to let other people speak. I just think that's another sort of nuance to add to the conversation.
Yeah, Meetali, I kind of wanted to bring you in here. I think that one of the things that we're talking about, and was huge about the Facebook files and some of what we've seen, is the disproportionate attention that that the rest of world, as they literally put it as they literally term it on the 10Ks, gets compared to the US, the disproportionate amount of time and attention, and the disproportionate amount of harms that are felt. I would remind everyone that 9% of Facebook users are based in the US. And every time I'm giving a talk and I give that tidbit to a US audience, they literally gasp. And when I give it in a global audience, anywhere else in the world, they're just kind of nod knowingly. But I just kind of like to point that out. And so, Meetali, do you see something kind of what we're talking about in the metrics? Do you think that that is where the change could happen? Or do you think that this has to be a broader policy commitment, a broader product change from the company to decide to do better in places where it's not going to have an immediate economic payoff?
So again, just to complicate the false choice, I don't think it's either or, I think it's both and. I think we need to be thinking about the shorter term solutions that the companies can take right now, whilst we continue to push for external regulation that would create more systemic change. And so I really see the efforts have to be at multiple levels, and the kinds of tweaks, frankly, the changes that Francis and Tristan are talking about are things that can happen in the more immediate short term. And, there's already some precedent for it. We can talk about the fact that, for example, WhatsApp kind of limiting its forwards, to 5 or whatnot is not enough, but it certainly has had an effect. And I think that's the type of thing that we're talking about in terms of slowing virality. Just looking at, and it doesn't prevent, obviously, friends and family groups from flourishing on WhatsApp. It's just really a measure to kind of try to slow things down and to prevent the worst actors from gaming the systems as they will. So yeah, I think we need to be pushing for both of those things and more. We need to also be pushing for paradigmatic cultural shifts in how we think about technology and democracy and our relationship to them. So there's change that's required at multiple levels.
So Francis, you'd kind of had said that you'd come back to kind of the question of how they would measure the good and the bad. And we were kind of talking about so I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that and where you think the measurements might come in at a practical level.
So they have some kinds of, one, I think there's an important thing, which is Facebook should have to publish whatever harms they're currently tracking, right? And they should have to have much more transparency around how do they define those harms and what is their accuracy at defining those harms? Because our current mode of interaction is people on the outside see harms at Facebook, and we have to try to convince the company that these harms exist on the platform. One of the advantages of having a regulatory body that had oversight over Facebook is that we would have a mechanism for surfacing, and we believe these things are problems Facebook needs to be transparent with us to demonstrate that this is actually not a harm on the platform. Once you have more transparency on what is the frequency of these problems, I think there's ways of doing weighted measures around what the relative harm is in aggregate. There's certain things where you can focus on how do you promote the good on a civic side. So for example, they have a concept known as positive motifs, or diverse positive motifs. So the idea that people who are good at speaking to diverse audiences, so that's people on the left and the right, about civic issues, that takes a lot of effort, right? Like right now, we don't reward in engagement-based ranking people who are good at being thoughtful and presenting things in a way that diverse people can listen to them. But there are ways to model that diversity, like the fact that your audiences are composed of not just people on the left or just people on the right, and be able to understand, like, do you lead to positive conversations, like the ability for people to go back and forth in ways that are constructive. And I think it'd be interesting, like, what if we did optimize more, or like try to over time have a larger volume of these conversations? Because that's the thing that we could be goaling on.
I was going to go, Shoshana, are you, I was hoping that I could ask you, as you have been in this space since 1978, as you outed yourself, I wasn't going to out you, but since 1978, and you have been so informative in shaping public knowledge about this from the days of Speaking Underwater. Do you feel like there has been a change in the last couple of weeks? And I mean, you brought up the recent events that have caused similar moments of awareness and coming around to things. Do you think we're approaching a moment in which we're in a position as a society to kind of capitalize on the knowledge that Frances has kind of brought us and that we've learned over the last from the documents that she's produced or gathered?
I actually believe that this sea change has been happening over the last couple of years, and that even before this marvelous intervention that Frances has made and all of the powerful discussions that have come out of it, we're seeing for the first time in the last 2 decades issues that have been considered settled, undiscussable, are being discussed and are suddenly regarded as not settled at all. We're seeing substantial legislative activity in the EU, and legislative acts, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the Democratic Governance of AI. These are legislative proposals that, together with the amendments that members of the European Parliament are adding to these proposals, for the first time, offer the promise of beginning to shift the directory, the direction, I'm sorry, to shift the trajectory, to shift our direction toward a democratic digital future. Not all of the solutions, not all of the final answers, but to begin to make this shift so that we establish the principle that the digital lives in democracy's house. And quite frankly, when I hear you discussing, the mechanisms of virality and friction and so forth, my response to that is that these are essential conversations, but they cannot be relegated to the realms of private capital. These are conversations that have to be held among citizens and lawmakers as we craft a digital and democratic century. So as much as we can urge Facebook to tweak, that is not the solution. The solution is that the digital has to live in democracy's house. And in my final remarks, actually, Kate, this is something I want to develop a little bit, but for now, I would say, look at what's happened in the EU and the discussions that are happening there. And then, eureka, in Washington, D.C., among our Congress folks, our senators, we are having discussions that have never been held before. Not only that, but we see our lawmakers engaging in these discussions with a kind of grasp and perspicacity that they have never evidenced before. We compare to Cambridge Analytica, the hearings on misinformation on March 24th of this year. We heard the members of the committees that were interrogating the tech executives. We heard them saying, look, we know that this is an economic logic that is driving misinformation. And we are no longer going to be bamboozled by your constant excuses and gaslighting and all of that. And I'm kind of paraphrasing, but this is the essence of what we said. We heard Congresswoman Eshoo talk about introducing a ban on surveillance advertising. And we have the same discussions about banning surveillance advertising happening now in Europe and happening within civil society. As you may know, Accountable Tech just last week, the week before, issued a formal petition to the Federal Trade Commission on the subject of banning surveillance advertising. So in all kinds of ways, we're seeing civil society and lawmakers on both sides of the Atlantic converging on issues that most people have considered, something that we can't even breach, that we can't even talk about. And certainly when I first went out to talk about my book in January of 2019, which turned into a long journey that has never stopped. But right in those early days, the idea that we would ban surveillance advertising, honestly, people looked at me, like I had 3 heads or more, 9.
Yeah, no, I think
the
that's
train
right.
has left the station, the toothpaste is out of the tube, and what Francis is doing brilliantly is accelerating, adding power, and a whole lot of crucial documentation to this whole new zeitgeist.
Yeah, I think that's very well put, and it's actually, it gives me a little bit of optimism, Shoshana, that maybe good things.
I'm totally I am nothing but optimistic.
Great.
This is moving. This is changing. This is what democracy does. We know how to do this.
And it's uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable for everyone. And a little bit, it's about to get a lot more uncomfortable for the tech companies, I think. So I am going to go to Q&A simply because we have just outstanding questions from all over the world. And I think they raise tremendous points. And this is I'm going to delegate it to Francis and Meetali. And it's from, I'm going to apologize if I mispronounce your name because I do not speak Spanish, from Jose Errázuriz, a professor for philosophy at the University in Chile. A question from a developing country. Because digital technology is not locally produced in developing countries, which I think is a tremendous kind of commentary on the aspects of kind of how we have exported US norms. So this is not his question. This is just I'm just kind of ad-libbing here a little bit about that part of it we don't talk about enough. We cannot hope to develop top-down strategies to tame digital technologies. Do you, activists, believe the bottom-up strategies are viable in order to improve our control over our digital lives? I'm thinking here about education, public education that could correct the digital illiteracy of our populations. And in parentheses, he adds, our generation has self-taught itself into digital life. I mean, I think a lot of us have self-taught ourselves into digital life, but maybe more so in Chile. So, but Francis, please go ahead.
I think he's flagging a really, really important concern, which is Facebook knows who can regulate it, right? The reason why they're spending, I think it's 87% of their misinformation budget on English, when it's actually 7% of its users are in the United States. It's not even 9%. It's crazy. The reason why they're doing that is because if people think that Facebook is unsafe in the United States, they'll regulate it. So it becomes this interesting question of like, how do we deal with this, right? So Facebook's extracting all this money from the rest of the world and then gives no control back to the rest of the world. I think the most basic thing that can be done, because this is something that is in the hands of people in Chile or other countries, is that some countries, particularly ones that are like say in close proximity to places like Russia or often China, have gone and developed misinformation campaigns and ways of inoculating the populace with the kinds of attitudes and things to look for to at least decrease the impact of misinformation. Because those countries have realized this is a national security issue when they're so close to powers that do regularly weaponize these platforms. At the same time, I feel like that's a little victim blamey for me to be like, oh, you should go and educate your populace because Facebook is doing these things. I think the secondary thing is I think we do need to do movement building in the United States that is based around the idea of like, we have more access to Facebook to demand change. And that this is one of those things where like, a big part of what motivated me to come forward was, I was worried that there were hundreds of thousands or millions of lives on the line in places that would never have an ability to counter Facebook, but I knew that I had the capacity to act, right? And I think it's a thing of we need more both individuals outside of tech companies putting pressure on legislators to care about these issues, and we need employees inside of companies speaking up for these users who don't have any other way of protecting themselves.
That's a great point, Meetali. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Couldn't agree with Frances more, and I'm ever grateful to Frances, to you for using the platform you have to really draw attention to this, because I think it is no secret that the worst harms of Facebook and other platforms are felt outside the US in exactly the communities that have the least political leverage to effectuate change. And so it's incumbent upon us, with our access and privilege in the so-called global north, to really bring those perspectives, to bring those harms to the table, and to accept our responsibility to tame our own beast, as it were, and really do what we can to bring those perspectives to both the companies and in meetings with executives and in meetings with lawmakers. So I couldn't agree with that more. And in fact, I think to answer the question, the ground up approach, again, I would never say it's not important. It's important, but digital literacy is important even in our communities right here at home. Mm-hmm. I think the distinction between global south, global north is a false one in that sense, because there's a heightened degree of tech literacy that we all need, whether it's a mature democracy or a fragile democracy. But I do think that the ground up approach suffers in one really key respect in a lot of these societies, which is that the very authoritarian governments that Facebook and others have propped up in terms of bringing them to power and maintaining their power are the governments that are that are quashing civil society and making it very difficult for people, communities, organizations to organize around tech reform. And I can speak, with personal experience in the process of doing some investigations that we were doing in other countries. We had researchers who were arrested, who had to flee the country. And so I think it's not insignificant that a lot of people on the ground are unable to really bring these issues to light in the ways that would be necessary to really effectuate, some kind of call to action from the ground, which makes it even more important for us to be doing this here.
Yeah. I have another, all of these are great questions, so maybe I should stop prefacing them with that. But Michael Kingston says, I'm a middle school teacher. I see the war for young people's attention and the unfolding young mental health crisis play out in my classroom every day. What role does the panel envisage for teachers in empowering young people? So I guess this is a little bit of a personal responsibility, or the role of educators and not the role of tech companies, but I think that we'd all be interested to hear both, in empowering young people to reshape their relationship with social media and addictive technology. Tristan, do you want to start?
I can try. I haven't focused as much in the recent days on how it affects young people. This is a really hard one. I just empathize with educators and parents because what Instagram and TikTok and Snapchat have done is created a locked-in communication channel so that you will be socially ostracized if you leave. I think a lot of people made this mistake, and actually Frances said this so eloquently in her testimony, that parents give their kids bad advice. And I think Facebook actually knows that because parents know, parents don't know how this stuff works. So first of all, a lot of people don't know, for example, that if you're a teenager and you use, say, Instagram as your primary thing, that's your number one way to message people. So like for us, I imagine we all use text message, iMessage on an iPhone or something like that, or Signal, something like that. But if you're a kid and the sort of engagement machine of body dysmorphia and the TikTok influencer machine of viral memes, that becomes your primary communication medium, and you can't sort of extract out the messaging from the engagement machine. You have been, locked into this awful ecosystem. In fact, we used to say what makes the current situation inhumane is that we're forced to use platforms that are so toxic, and that there's actually no easy way to kind of get out of that. And I think, Frances, you said in your testimony that you would prefer a world where people don't even use social media until over 18. I happen to agree. I don't know if I would say make that a law, but I think it's interesting, and I think it's provocative, and I think it's a direction that we should consider going. I don't think that we would be better off. And I love what Shoshana said about digital lives in democracy's house, or in well-being's house. And I feel like when we had Sesame Street growing up, we had child psychologists designing children's education with everything they know about child psychology, but not to manipulate kids, but to try to create the most enriching and learning-oriented experience and compassion-oriented experience. And we don't have that. And it's important to say one last thing. China has recently taken some very broad steps with regard to how children use its platforms. If you're under the age of, I think it's 14, TikTok, you can only use it for 40 minutes a day. And they actually, when you scroll, they give you museum exhibits, science experiments you can do at home, and patriotism videos, because they realize that digital lives in China's house, in the CCP's house, and they want their kids to be astronauts. And we take our hand off the steering wheel and allow Instagram and TikTok to teach our kids to be influencers. And which of those societies, do you want to live in, and sort of what it looks like? I don't mean we should adopt the China model, just to be really clear. I'm not saying that.
Yeah, but what are you saying then? Because that sounds very paternalistic, frankly. Like, I mean, it's one thing to give the option of Sesame Street. It is like a very, and also have Bugs Bunny. It's a very different thing to have kind of like, to be having Facebook force you to eat broccoli. Yeah, I really am curious what you think.
Totally. Sorry, to be really clear, I'm not suggesting that there should be an authoritarian regulation like that here in the States. It should be a democratic conversation. That's what it should be. I do think Apple has an interesting role in giving parents much better tools to control their kids' use. And I was going to say one more other thing, but I think I forgot. Yeah, I'll let others answer the rest.
Yeah, Frances, do you want to pop in?
So I think to go back to the original question of like, what's the role for schools? Tristan hit on a really important thing, which is that Facebook's own research says kids feel profoundly alone when they struggle with the problems they're facing. And for those who don't have children or haven't been exposed to what teenagers are experiencing, the experience of being a teenager today is very, very different than it was for even when I was a teenager, which was not really that long ago. It used to be that it didn't matter how bad school was, you could go home at the end of the day. And for the vast majority of kids who have good home lives, they got a break. It didn't matter how bad you got bullied, you got a solid 16 hours to reset before you went back into the fray. And now that bullying or that harassment follows kids into their bedrooms. Like the last thing kids see before they fall asleep at night is someone being cruel to them, or they wake up in the morning into some horrible slur about them or about their personality. And, that really, really wears kids down. And Facebook knows that parents don't have the right context about neurological development. They don't have the right context on what is or isn't effective for coaching kids on how to deal with these situations. And they give advice like, why don't you just turn off your phone? Why don't you just not use it? And the reality is that kids fear being ostracized. That's in Facebook docs if they don't use the product. That kids say, I know it doesn't make me happy. I know I'm not having fun. I know I don't want to use it, but I also feel like I can't stop. And so I think there's a real role for schools in helping to pull together high quality information and make sure that every parent gets given that information regularly on like what is or isn't constructive in terms of how to coach and support your kids. Because right now parents are trying really hard, and because there's those gaps, those differences in lived experience, the parents just aren't being set up to succeed, and the parents are struggling just as much as the kids are.
Tristan, do you want to add something in? I also was going to ask if you could, you said that you've been working on children in the past, but I'd love it if you could tell us what we can also as adults know, like as to in terms of like not falling into these same habits and traps.
You mean one addiction. Go ahead, Shoshana. Sorry.
I think let's add a couple of dimensions to this discussion about school education. You know, there's a long thread and debate in education. Education should be developmental. Education should help children develop, children develop. And when we're talking about the teens and the preteens that are the targets of these machine processes, we're talking about human beings who are at a moment in their developmental lives where the only way that I exist is in the reflection of others. These are developmental processes, that are well documented, well established from the beginning of the 20th century, long before social media. What happens in social media is that these things are intensified exactly as you're describing them. Now we are so pegados, so stuck into these systems, can't move out of these systems, that the spaces, the experiences, the human relationships in which normally in that part of adolescence and early adulthood, normally we would be developing a self. We would be developing an internal reference space where it's not just what do they think I should do, but what do I think I should do? And what's happening is that space has been just filled and colonized by all of these processes that have them stuck. So it's interfering in what have been considered, healthy, normal developmental processes relevant to the modern age. We have to become selves to become autonomous citizens, people who can have opinions and vote and do all the things that we're supposed to do in a democratic society. So, teacher, what can schools do? What can teachers do? On the one hand, teachers are embattled right now from the same systems because schools have become sites of surveillance almost as intense as workplaces, students and faculty. And because teachers are saddled with Google Classroom, Google Education, this denatured, dehumanized version of education that is taking all of the relationship and all of the real learning out of school and delegating it to these systems, because we're in an era where public institutions have been scraped to the bone for all of the reasons that we all understand, neoliberalism, blah, blah, blah. So teachers are really embattled. And it takes perhaps not just a single teacher, but a school and maybe a school system to say, we're going to reinstitute the human and the relationship and the relational. One tiny last point. A Gallup poll several years ago, I never heard anybody mention it. It asked college students a few years after they had graduated, it asked them, what were the most important elements in your college experience that contributed to your well-being and your success? And they expected, oh, the great libraries and the great dormitories and the, you know, the swimming pools, and all the things that universities and colleges are spending money on. Across the board, basically, all of these people who were defined as really successful and flourishing and having a lot of well-being, they all said the same thing, one thing. And they said it was having a relationship with a professor or a mentor who really believed in me, who really felt that I was special, who really felt that I had something special to contribute. That relationship changed everything, right? That's the developmental relationship. It doesn't cost much, but we have to free and empower our teachers in our schools to come back to the human center of education.
Yeah, I think that's great. Tristan, I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about what I had asked before, but I love that point, Shoshana, and I think that it's a great kind of practical advice to kind of like also be thinking about other systems that we can reform besides just directly the tech platforms, and how these all are working together and being kind of and the influence that they're peddling between them. So I think that that's a great point. Tristan?
No, I think what Shoshana said was perfect. And I, as a student of developmental psychology, and I just really recommend everyone read Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, because I think it kind of said everything, and we're all just living in the wake of it. You know, I think it's just one last thing. It's just important to point out when Shoshana talked about the virtuality of my virtual self and what they think of me there. It's important to realize that part of the business model of engagement is creating these kinds of virtual social ties and virtual social pressure and virtual subject feeling like other people are watching me, because that's what creates the need that I have to go back in there and manage my virtual self. And so even the idea that we have a kind of virtual avatar that we have to manage is itself incentivized by this engagement economy. And if you want to sort of zoom out and think about the kind of master of the universe play, it's not just attention or engagement, it's sort of creating the virtual metaverse, right? That's what they're all competing for, is to create that virtual world that owns as much of your time. And that's what the glasses are about. And that's what all these things are about. And so again, as Shoshana said so eloquently, digital lives in democracy's house. It lives in societal values house. And I worry, if I'll say anything, since I know we're wrapping up too, that I think the important thing is to not just use this moment to get to slightly less toxic social media, but to ask, what is a relationship between technology and democracy that gives us a stronger democracy? Because right now we can notice that China is consciously employing technology to make stronger autocracies. And they're basically using superstructure, their culture and social structure law, to bind the power of infrastructure, which is technology. That's from Marvin Harris. Typically, when new infrastructure comes around, the free press killed feudalism and it gave us democracy. But we have this new tech, this new AI-powered curated engagement tech. That thing kills democracy in the same way that the printing press kills feudalism, unless you manage it with superstructure, culture, and social structure law. And so I think that the key thing is actually, how do we have a world where democracies are consciously employing technology to create stronger and better democracies, not saying we're anti-technology because then China just builds, you know, the other thing. We have to figure out that right relationship. But the premise of humane technology is to make sure, as Frances said so eloquently in her testimony, that it's human-centric first.
Yeah, I think that that's a wonderful point. If there is going to be this weaponization and this solidification of power from autocratic countries in the infrastructure, and to encode their culture in the infrastructure and their society in the infrastructure, then why not do it for democracies instead of letting it undo itself? So I think that that's an amazing point. So we have time for one more question, and then we're going to wrap. That question is going to be from Professor Anat Alam-Beck. Is this part of a tech employee revolt or more? And do you foresee, I think this is a great question to end on, do you foresee more activism from tech employees? And so I'm going to pose this to Frances first, and then kind of hear from everybody. But I think that this is a wonderful kind of way to wrap up for today. Go ahead, Frances.
One of the most common questions I've been asked by people in Congress and Senate is around, you know, what was my whistleblowing experience like, and what support do whistleblowers need? And I think part of what has been driving that question is that, you know, a lot of these platforms, like just our larger technology companies, often have things about them that you can basically only learn about, like even just period learn about, not a question of like having skills where, you know, you might go to college and get a master's degree. These are literally topics where you can only learn about them at these places. And so you end up in a situation where people on the outside, like people in the Senate, can ask questions about Facebook, but they have to just kind of believe Facebook's answers because, you know, the level of understanding inside the company and outside the company is just completely, you know, out of whack. And so I think there is a real need for whistleblowers to come forward. And I encourage you all to talk to someone like Whistleblower Aid, which is the legal aid group that has supported me throughout this entire thing. They're really wonderful. They've never made me pay a dime, so go toss them some. They have a GoFundMe, just to plug them. And I think it's really important, and because whistleblowers are one of the only things that can actually give us even kind of a chance in terms of maintaining the autonomy of our democracies versus these large companies with network effects, right? They're going to keep getting bigger. They're going to keep being more profitable. The only way we stand kind of a chance is if individual employees stand up, and if they see things where they think people's lives are on the line, they need to act. One of the things that I'm really heartened by is there is movement right now to extend whistleblower protections to people at private companies, not just public ones. So I filed with the SEC, which covers public misstatements and omissions by public companies. If I had worked at TikTok, I wouldn't have been protected. And so there is discussions around extending reforms there and on making them more robust. So I hope people in Congress do that.
Great point. Meetali?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that whistleblowers, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, have given me hope that the conscience of humanity can withstand the excesses of the business model that drives Silicon Valley. And I think that it's incumbent upon us to really do what we can to rally around whistleblowers, to lift them up, to kind of create the climate of safety, and to push for enhanced whistleblower regulations. I mean, in California, recently, Ifeoma Azoma, one of the tech whistleblowers that came before, very successfully adopted, the California legislature to adopt the Silence No More Act. And I think we need to see more.
To get rid of NDAs specifically.
To get rid of NDAs specifically. And that type of, I think, movement is one that I hope will gain momentum, you know, at state level and ultimately hopefully at federal level, and in other countries. So I think that there's a real sense of obligation that I feel as an activist standing in allyship with whistleblowers to do more to really enhance the kind of regulatory frameworks that we have.
Tristan?
Yeah, just to give another plug for Ifeoma Azoma's, I don't know, my camera keeps doing that. Another plug to Ifeoma Azoma's, I think it's called the Tech Worker Handbook. Is that right, Meetali?
Yes, she just finished it.
Yeah, she just released it, and it's a guide for whistleblowers who, you know, want to come out. I think I would just say this, that when it comes to governance, I mean, essentially, there's these different dimensions of what we need. Obviously, we need more whistleblowers who are providing transparency about harms that we, the public, otherwise don't know and that the government doesn't know. We need good government oversight. We need academics. We need NGOs. But the combined power of those groups' ability to coordinate has to exceed the ability of the tech companies to coordinate. That's the only thing that's going to work, right? And so what I want to just point out is in military theory, John Boyd, who's sort of one of the best Air Force pilots, said that, you know, the OODA loop is the observe, orient, decide, and act loop. How fast can you observe the situation, orient yourself, make a decision, act, and then go back into the loop? And that was sort of the thing that outcompeted all the other military strategies. And if you think about the combined power of whistleblowers, government, academics, NGOs, nonprofits, we're all trying to observe the situation, orient, and then decide and act. And every moment that goes by, Facebook doesn't have to answer to that. It doesn't have a left-right divide. It doesn't have 4-year plans, it doesn't have 4-year term limits. It gets to observe, orient, decide, and act much faster and with trillions of dollars of resources compared to the small resources that are usually of those combined groups. And so in getting to the world that we want to live in of governance, which is hopefully teeing up maybe the next panel of folks, especially when we talk about law and how fast does law move, we need the OODA loops of those collective processes to move as fast or faster than the harms emitted by the OODA loops of tech. Which is another way of saying what I said, which is, to repeat it one more time, because I think it's a great line, digital lives in democracy's house.
Yeah. To bring us back to the tortoise and the hare, and the tortoise here, I would say, is definitely law. in this thing, it does move very slowly, and I'm looking forward to the next panel. We're going to wrap at 7:40, but to bring us kind of back to the tortoise and the hare and the original metaphor, Shoshana, your thoughts on this question?
On which question, Kate?
The idea of tech workers and the need for whistleblowers, and whether most of the activists need to be coming from inside the platforms at this point, or we need more of them.
Well, I mean, this has been a perennial issue. If you're studying surveillance capitalism, nobody is opening the door to help you understand it, because the whole point is that the mechanisms have to be hidden. They're hidden vis-a-vis users as far as being engineered to bypass individual and collective awareness. And they're certainly hidden in terms of researchers and, and people who want to find out about, inspect, and opine and engage with those systems. So all along, I mean, I was, researching and writing for 7 or 8 years to complete this book. And all along, I was dependent upon informants. I was dependent upon leaked documents. I was dependent upon the occasional whistleblower. These are the things. And other than that, literally, crawling the web for every utterance, every off-the-cuff remark, everything that gives you a little bit of insight into what executives are really, really thinking and doing. In the end, I felt like I could write a Facebook dictionary where, so that, because all of Facebook's language is gaslighting. And so I could construct a dictionary where you could look up what Facebook is saying and figure out what it really means. And, one of the prominent ones that we've been talking about today is engagement. And of course, engagement is one of many euphemisms. Engagement is simply a vehicle for increased extraction, and extraction is necessary for better prediction. So, engagement is the public-facing term that sounds kind of nice, as Tristan was alluding to, engagement, the natural fallacy. But in fact, engagement is simply, this Trojan horse for massive scale extraction. And there are many, many euphemisms like that, just things like, cyberspace is one of my favorites. Cyberspace is a term that was created essentially to defend the tech companies' territories from law. And they created a mythology that said somehow cyberspace is this other kind of world that is impervious to territorial laws. And somehow, we were innocent enough and ignorant enough and hopeful enough that we believed them at a time when we thought that these folks were leading us toward a positive future, which turned out not to be true. So all of that is kind of encapsulated in the fact that these companies work hard at being inscrutable and indecipherable. And if it weren't for these breakthroughs, as Francis has provided us with, we would know a lot less. And that in itself is intolerable, because they have, as we've been discussing, and very critical for my work now, literally unaccountable power over the information systems and information infrastructures that are mission critical for society, for individual social participation, for economic participation. And we stand on the sidelines as bystanders saying, you know, please, Mr. Zuckerberg, please, can't you do this differently? Can't you do this better? When, you know, they have all the power and all the control. This has to change. Coming back to our democratic theme, democratic governance is what rules here, what must rule. This is what democracies do. We've done it all through our histories, and we have reined in and constrained rogue industries and tethered them to democratic aspirations and the democratic form of government imperfectly, but tethered so that we could find some kind of equilibrium, for example, between ultimately industrial capitalism and democracy. We are in the first phases of our information civilization where we have not yet tackled this big work, the rights, the laws, and the public institutions that we need to make our individuals, our collective behavior safe for democracy in this century.